I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as the world reacts to America's operation in Venezuela over the weekend, we explore Moscow's muted response, hinting at the tension in Moscow between sticking up for an ally and condemning the US action, thereby risking Trump's wrath, or applauding the example of international intervention. We also hear from Hungary, where Francis has been putting questions to its Prime Minister for the last 15 years, Viktor Orbán.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 5th of January, 3 years and 317 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Russia expert, James Kilner. I started by introducing the Russian response to America's action in Venezuela over the weekend. So the weekend news was dominated, as you'll know, by events in Venezuela. That's not for this pod to major on, but there is definitely some crossover. Now, the Russian response so far has been fairly muted. It seems as if they can't decide between outright condemnation of the US assault and tacitly supporting it as a vehicle to permit their own action. The former obviously draws direct criticism on Putin and would upset Donald Trump, but the latter flies in the face of Russia's support for Venezuela and other countries in the region opposing the United States, such as Cuba. So, overall, quite a cool response from Moscow so far, and one that leans away from trying to use the US action as a way to endorse intervention in sovereign states. The strongest formal signal I've seen is a joint statement by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Belarusian Foreign Minister Mikhail Rezhenkov, who condemned the operation, calling for the US to return Maduro and his wife to Venezuela. Now, that's hardly the strongest diplomatic response, and one obviously that says nothing about any legality issues. I'm going to be asking James to dig into this more a little bit later. So the main news regarding Ukraine over the weekend came also from the diplomatic front. Saturday saw a meeting between Ukrainian officials and advisors of the Coalition of the Willing Leaders in Kyiv, ahead of a leaders' meeting tomorrow expected in Paris. Now, after the meeting on Saturday, President Zelensky said any future security guarantees for Ukraine must include the physical presence of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, and he cited British and French forces as essential for peace. Interesting. That's not going to go down well in certain quarters. Now, there's still no final version of the security guarantees part of that draft 20-point peace plan that was discussed with Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago in Florida just before New Year. But President Zelensky said, undoubtedly, the military presence is important to us, and undoubtedly, not everyone is ready for this. But the presence is one of the most important factors, and even the existence of the Coalition of the Willing depends on whether they are ready to step up their presence. The UK and France are the chairs, joint chairs of the Coalition of the Willing. He said their military presence is mandatory. Now, perhaps hinting at problems to come, he then said there is a parliamentary dimension because even if a leader is ready to make certain decisions, ready to help Ukraine, even if the military is ready to be present in Ukraine, parliamentary backing is still required under the constitutions of many European countries. So, Saturday, in what President Zelensky said was an active day, it saw 18 participants from Europe join Ukrainian colleagues in person. I think the United States dialed in virtually. President Zelensky said, we're also coordinating with the American side. We thought last week that the US was not going to be there in person. I think that suggests that that's actually what happened. No details have been released about what was discussed or any of the outcomes. But afterwards, President Zelensky said, I had a good conversation with Keir Starmer, Britain's Prime Minister. A good conversation with Keir Starmer about how to move forward in diplomacy at this stage and about how together we can achieve greater justice in light of everything Russia has brought through this war. So it doesn't sound like an absolute barnstormer of a meeting, if I'm totally honest. But again, hopefully more stuff happened behind closed doors. Now, on the ground in Ukraine, no real movement of the lines. Ukrainian Joint Forces Task Force spokesperson Colonel Viktor Orbán said yesterday that Russia had resumed ground combat operations in Kharkiv Oblast following a pause in that area. He said they're trying to bypass Vovchansk to the east, still through this tactic of using small teams, 2 or 3 people, sort of rushing forward, and then any survivors trying to blob together to form larger groups. So no change there in those tactics. I mention that because that's slightly different from what we've seen down in the Zaporizhia area around Huliopol, where they were operating in larger groups. Anyway, Colonel Orbán also said there are fewer than 70 Russian soldiers still in the city of Kupiansk, but it does look as if Russia's trying to push on that city from the southeast. Russian MOD claiming an advance in the region there in the vicinity of the village of Podolye, which is about 10 kilometers away to the southeast of Kupiansk, but I've not seen that confirmed anywhere else. In the Donbass, Ukraine's air assault forces said yesterday that Russian reports about the capture of the town of Rodinsk in Donetsk Oblast were false. They said Ukrainian soldiers continue to hold the defensive line inside the town and on the outskirts. This is about 5 k's north of Pokrovsk, up in the area of Dobropia that we were speaking about last year. Now, Russia's defense ministry claimed the capture of Rodinsk along with Minorad and 2 other villages on Friday, although, as I say, that's not been confirmed by Ukraine. Now, other news, 95 individuals, including citizens of Russia, perhaps unexpectedly, and China, a bit more surprisingly, along with 70 companies and legal entities linked to the servicing of Russia's military-industrial complex, were hit with sanctions yesterday. Sanctions include a full asset freeze, a temporary ban on managing or disposing of property, restrictions on trade operations, the suspension of transit flights and transportation through Ukrainian territory, and the revocation of state honours. A statement released by the President's office said the imposed restrictions are intended to complicate the servicing of Russia's military-industrial complex and to limit its capacity to produce weapons and military equipment used in the war against Ukraine. Now, some of those entities, we're told, could also face European sanctions in the near future. I think that might be the first statement from the President's office under Kirill Budanov's stewardship. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's the first one I've seen. Now, in Ukraine, a Ukrainian soldier was injured yesterday by a car bomb in Kyiv's northern Obolon district. The blast occurred about 10:30 a.m. local time. This comes from a Kyiv Independent reporter who was at the scene on the ground. No further details known about the blast or the individual, but Ukrainian authorities are treating it as a terror attack. So over the weekend, Russia fired hundreds of drones at Ukraine. There were deaths and injuries across the country. Last night alone, 165 drones were fired, at least 1 person killed, others injured after a hospital was hit in Kyiv, President Zelensky reported this morning. The State Emergency Service said that the second floor of a private 4-storey hospital was hit, causing damage to the inpatient ward. It said 25 people were evacuated from the premises. Now, also over the weekend, there were some political moves, a bit of reshuffling of appointments following that news that Kirill Budanov is going to take on the post of chief of the president's office, obviously after Andrei Yermak. Now, Budanov at the HUR, the Military Intelligence Department, he's going to be replaced by Oleh Ivashenko, who's the current Foreign Intelligence Service chief. And Ukraine is, President Zelensky is proposing a new defence minister. Posts of that at that level have to be approved by Parliament, but President Zelensky's proposal is that Mikhailo Fedorov becomes the new defence minister. 34-year-old Mr. Fedorov, he currently serves as Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister and Digital Transformation Minister, one of very few officials who have been with President Zelensky's team since the start of his political career in 2019. And he's the only minister to survive all the previous government reshuffles. President Zelensky said Mikhailo is deeply involved in the issues related to the drone line and works very effectively on digitising public services and processes. Together with all our military, the Army Command, national weapons producers and Ukraine's partners, we must implement defence sector changes. Now, as I say, Parliament is going to need to approve this appointment, but I can't imagine there'll be any real hiccups there. Mr. Fedorov will replace, if he gets the job, Denis Shmyhal, who's only been in post, less than 6 months. President Zelensky said that Mr. Shmyhal will take on a no less important role elsewhere in the government. Bit of a sideways move, I suppose. Doesn't really scream promotion to me. Anyway, A quick one on Mikhailo Fedorov. So he's a former businessman, became President Zelensky's advisor and chief digital strategist. He was then elected to parliament for President Zelensky's party, rapidly elevated to become deputy prime minister, the youngest ever minister in Ukraine. He led the newly created Digital Transformation Ministry. That's been responsible for all kind of new high-tech weapons systems, equipment, drones, electronic warfare, all that kind of jazz. He also launched Brave One. Now, you might hear Brave One around the bazaars. That's the project that links the Digital Transformation Ministry and the MOD and the Defence Ministry. He's thought, Mr. Fedorov, this is thought to have had a tense relationship with Andrei Yermak. Now, there were a lot of other appointments over the weekend. Lieutenant General Sir Dominic is to be replaced as interim head of Ukraine's State Border Guard Service by First Deputy Valery Vavrenyuk. Now, that is temporary pending a permanent replacement, but the State Border Guard Service, now officially part of the MOD, is responsible for policing Ukraine's state border on land and water. Also on Saturday, President Zelensky issued a list of new governors. Or he said a new list, was being finalised for Vinnytsia, Ternopil, Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk and Chernivtsi oblasts. They are, most of them over in the west, two in the centre of the country. Now, inside Russia, Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR again, Bogdanov's old lot, said yesterday that an explosive device detonated on Boxing Day, December 26th, at the entrance of the Russian 47th Missile Brigade in Koronovsk in Krasnodar, about 150 km east of the Kerch Bridge, had detonated. They said the explosion hit a Kamaz military vehicle, basically a truck, carrying Russian military personnel, causing an unspecified number of casualties. This reporting comes from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. No reason given for why the note from Ukraine came out, a couple of weeks or a week and a half late. Now, inside Russia, overnight Saturday to Sunday, Russian air defence systems say they shot down 132 Ukrainian drones, including 11 over Moscow Oblast. This comes from Russian Defence Ministry. They said Ukrainian drones were also shot down over Bryansk, Oryol, Kursk, Rostov, Belgorod, Tula, Kaluga, Moscow and Lipetsk oblasts. Quite a large area, mostly between Moscow and Ukraine. Moscow's Vnukovo and Zhukovsky airports were temporarily closed during this wave of attacks. Another Ukrainian drone attack last night is said to have hit the Energia factory in Russia's Lipetsk Oblast, the city of Yelets, about 250 km north of the border, about the same distance south of Moscow, was hit. That is said to produce critical components for Russian missiles and drones, including batteries for Iskander ballistic missiles and other cruise missile systems. That factory was hit twice last year, in May and July. Now, remember that story last week? Was it last week or the week before? We'll get a bit blurry. The alleged Ukrainian drone strike on Putin's residence. It was widely disputed at the time. Donald Trump's initial comments seemed to suggest that he thought there was some credibility to them. However, he's walked those back. Speaking to reporters yesterday on Air Force One, he said, "We don't believe that happened now that we've been able to check." So hopefully that puts that one to bed. It was complete hogwash at the time. There was the Russian MOD and Foreign Service came out with differing reports, and the drone that they eventually drummed up to show photos of to say that it had happened was a Russian drone with, it was a complete hogwash. Anyway, turns out Donald Trump now believes it did not happen. Now, I'll point you to a story by Sean Walker in The Guardian. I put a link in the episode notes today about 42-year-old Yulia Lemyshenko from Kharkiv. She was Ukraine's champion weightlifter in 2021. She then disappeared in autumn 2023, only to resurface in a Moscow courtroom, accused of plotting sabotage and assassinations in Russia on behalf of the Ukrainian security services. Prosecutors claimed that Ms. Lemyshenko had blown up power lines outside St. Petersburg and had later travelled to Voronezh, where she was staking out a Russian Air Force commander with a view to killing him. She was sentenced this month to 19 years in prison, and during the proceedings, she did not deny the accusations but said her conscience was clear. Her final words to the court were, "Maybe I'm making my position worse with my words, but my honour and conscience are more important to me. I did what I considered necessary." We'll put the link to Sean's wider story, as I said, in the episode notes. And then finally, Euromaidan Press are reporting that a 22-year-old luxury class SUV vehicle confiscated from a drunk driver in Latvia is now bound for Ukraine as part of the country's ongoing support for Kyiv. This comes from Latvia's Interior Ministry. So Latvia's donating 21 confiscated vehicles to Ukraine, all seized by authorities, many from drunk drivers. And the cars are going to be used by Ukraine's Defence Ministry, National Guard and a Kharkiv hospital. Since 2023, Euromaidan say that Latvia has handed over more than 600 vehicles to support combat and humanitarian efforts across frontline areas. Yet another reason not to drink and drive. Now, you might be wondering where Francis is. Well, let's hear from him now. He's in Hungary, freezing his socks off, but managing to put a few questions to Viktor Orbán at his annual press conference. He asked for Mr. Orbán's reaction to the US military operation in Venezuela and how it might compare morally with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Greetings from the shores of the Danube here in snowy Budapest. It's -5 degrees centigrade here, pretty chilly, though I've not received a frosty reception just yet. But the fact is, as you'll know, that this is a country in both the EU and NATO which takes a profoundly different stance towards Russia and its war than the majority of member states of both institutions, despite, or perhaps because, Ukraine is on its eastern border. It's blocked multiple initiatives within the EU to go further in its support for Kyiv, and its government has adopted what it calls a common sense approach to the conflict, with its Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who faces a fiercely contested election in April, objecting to European leaders who he argues are prolonging the war rather than Putin. Now, I'm here with Elliot Daly from our video team, working on several stories for The Telegraph, looking deeper into Hungary's role and possible future, but mainly asking whether Hungary is an outlier in Europe, clinging to a faded model of realpolitik conservatism focused on national values and interests at the expense of collective values and institutions, or if its vision of what the years ahead will look like in Europe is indicative as countries destabilised, threatened, turn inwards and adopt what they would call a more pragmatic, fragmented approach to foreign policy. Now, most of that you'll hear in future episodes, but today I was given the opportunity to attend Viktor Orbán's annual press conference with international media, where I was able to ask him the following, which he answered in English. Francis Dearnley, The Telegraph, thank you for your time. How are the US actions in Venezuela different from Putin's actions in Russia? And how would you respond if Trump carried out his threat of annexing Greenland, given that it is a part of a NATO member state?
Each comparison is more than dangerous. So if you allow me, I would not like to make any comparison between the Russian-Ukrainian war and Venezuela, United States, whatever. Each cases are different by legal character and by political context as well. So comparison is not helpful here. We have to take each of them as they are, or as it is. Greenland, it's an easy issue because it's an in-house issue, may I say. It's a NATO issue. Denmark is part of NATO, United States is part of NATO. If anybody would like to have any change, we can discuss it inside the NATO. Hungary is not a decisive force inside NATO, but if that discussion will appear, Hungary will have an opinion on that, definitely.
Now, I asked that question not for a condemnation regarding Venezuela, but to ask him to try and explain the difference between Russia's war and Trump's action, especially given the latest threat from Trump regarding Greenland. I thought his answer on Denmark was quite telling. Now, speaking in Hungarian, he talked about his interpretation of the geopolitical situation. We are entering a new era, he said. The era that ended in 2025 was the liberal world order. We're now in a world of new laws, the era of nations. We have been pioneers in Hungary of this era. He then said Venezuela is one of the manifestations of this new era. The US is capable of controlling 40 to 45% of the oil reserves of the world. This will allow them to influence energy markets. This is good news for Hungary. The Hungarian position is whether it is good or bad for Hungary. I will not shed a tear for the fall of any narco state, however. Now, in this brave new world, he said his priorities were threefold. Energy, particularly self-sufficiency. He criticised the sanctions-like approach adopted from Brussels towards them, and he said that he hoped that sanctions will be lifted against Russia when the war ends. Migration, second, critical of the approach adopted by the EU. He said we're not receiving any migrants from any non-Western countries. And then thirdly, the economy. He said the wartime loan to Ukraine will not be taken out here. Everyone knows the Ukrainians will never repay this. He continued, we're not sending any weapons. We believe this does not serve the interests of peace. The choice is simple. We either walk the path of Brussels and war or the Hungarian way. Indeed, most questions were on Brussels, not Ukraine. When Britain left, federalism in Europe became inevitable, he said. Now, I mentioned at the top the election that's coming in April, fiercely contested, and may see Orban pushed from power. He said there's no cause for concern over conscripting people for Ukraine. People have a choice, but there is a pro-war party in Hungary. He's referencing the opposition there. And just to wrap up, he was asked about 1956, of course, the resistance against the Soviet occupation of Hungary. And he said that now that Americans were talking to Moscow with regard to the war, it had proved their position right, and that there should be no comparison between the two eras, as some have made, saying that because of 1956, Hungary should support Ukraine. Orban was having none of that. So no surprises, but it summarises the situation here quite neatly. I think, as I say, in future episodes, I'll be exploring much more about Hungary's role and how the election might radically change their stance. But for now, it's time for us to warm ourselves up. It's biting cold here, and there is a toasty historic castle nearby with our names on it. Goodbye for now. Farewell from Budapest.
Now then, delighted to turn for the first time in 2026 to James Kilner, our expert on many things. But James, delighted to have you with us today. Thank you for dialing in. I note that the Russian Foreign Ministry, talking about Venezuela, they put out a statement saying this morning the United States committed an act of armed aggression against Venezuela. This is deeply concerning and condemnable. The pretexts used to justify these actions are unfounded. Ideological hostility has triumphed over business-like pragmatism and a willingness to build relationships of trust and predictability. Now, James, thank God somebody is finally sticking up for the principle of national sovereignty. But what else have you seen Russia saying? And who do I call to congratulate them for finally upholding decency and integrity? Welcome back, James.
Thank you, Dom, and Happy New Year. Very nice to be back. Yeah, indeed, the Kremlin is the one apparently upholding national sovereignty with this statement on Saturday, rather sort of as expected, calling out the US for being a baddie, like you said, condemnable action and hostility. But actually, the unofficial reaction, where the sort of reading between the lines, where you get the real feeling for what the Kremlin is doing. So the official reaction, I'd say, was trope, was expected. The unofficial reaction, which they put out through their various newspapers and websites, has been much more nuanced. I'd say it's been much more on side with the US, frankly, and is also sort of slightly multi-layered, which makes it an interesting topic to look through. Firstly, I think a lot of the Russian commentators were actually incredibly impressed with the efficiency of the US operation, and were envious. You had one commentator in Vedomosti, Moscow-based newspaper this morning, calling it a significant media and tactical success with minimum costs. You had Margarita Simonian, one of Putin's favourite propagandists, saying that the Kremlin would be jealous. And you had military bloggers who have been, critical of the way the Kremlin's carried out its war, saying that, this is a highly competent operation. The point is here, commentators are basically referencing botched operation the Kremlin tried to pull off in February 22 when it tried to capture Kiev in a couple of days and also set off various assassination groups to track down Zelensky and kill him. They failed on both accounts. And here they see the US putting off this stunt side of the world. So there's envy in this whole bundle, which is interesting. And then you get the sort of political realism as well. So you get a sort of a consensus, really, among the commentators in the Russian media saying, actually, you know what, Venezuela may have been an ally of sorts to the Kremlin, but it very much sits within the US sphere of influence, and we're fine with that. They generally agree that there's very little the Kremlin could have done to help Venezuela, and it also suits the Kremlin's narrative, obviously, when it talks about the world being divided into multipolar units where great powers dominate their neighbours. Obviously, the subtext here is that Russia is doing it to Ukraine, it's treating Ukraine roughly how the US sees Venezuela. Obviously, very different outcomes, but that's where they're going with that one. And I want to read you a quick quote from an analyst called Fyodor Kulyanov, who's the editor of a Telegram channel called Russia in Global Affairs, because he takes this point one bit further. He reveals another sense of the Kremlin thinking here. He said, it will be impossible to provide real assistance to a country so far away and in a truly different geopolitical reality, i.e. subtext here is Venezuela's very much in the US sphere of influence. He then carries on, this is a technical and logistical reason, but there is also a political one. Putin and Trump currently have another issue, one that is incomparably more pressing for Moscow. That's Ukraine. And despite all its sympathies for Caracas, the Kremlin is unlikely to disrupt the entire game with a fundamentally more important partner for the sake of a secondary issue. So the really key bit of this quote is the reference by this analyst to the US as a fundamentally more important partner. He's saying that the Kremlin values its relationship with the US, with Trump, far higher than it did with Maduro or with Venezuela, who was, obviously a very junior partner in an alliance. And I think, this sort of pragmatic approach to the Venezuela-Maduro issue is coming through in all the analysis, that the Kremlin's really far more interested in building up and keeping a good, strong relationship with Trump, their sort of man in the White House, as they say it, their sort of chance to impose a deal of their making to suit them if they can get it in Ukraine. That is much, much more important to the Kremlin than riding to the rescue of Maduro. And we've seen this pragmatic approach in the Kremlin rolling out over the last few years. It was the same in Syria just over a year ago. It was very much the same in Iran last summer when Israel and the US bombed Iran, despite a sort of enhanced partnership or alliance pact being signed in January. By June, the Kremlin has sort of walked away from this and actually provided Israel with logistical intelligence during its bombing runs against Iran. The point is here that when Israel and the US was bombing Iran last summer, the Kremlin stayed away from helping Iran, despite this alliance that it supposedly signed, because it saw an opportunity to improve its relationship with Israel at that moment. And it's doing the same again, re Venezuela. It's staying out of the Venezuela issue because it values its relationship with the US and Trump far higher than it does with Venezuela.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's very obvious. On the one hand, it's just pure realpolitik and quite straightforward. But this idea that support for Venezuela is just a secondary issue, I wonder how that kind of idea is going down, for example, in Cuba. Anyway, I've got a feeling we might find out in the near future. But James, Donald Trump has told the Atlantic magazine that Greenland is, quote, surrounded by Russian and Chinese ships. He said for that reason, we do need Greenland, absolutely. How is that spat being seen in Russia? And have they got loads of ships around Greenland?
So my reading on this is that, and I know we've had this troublesome tweet in the last 24 hours by a lady who's linked to the White House of Greenland casing a US flag. And that's got everyone interested in the Greenland question again. It's a massive holiday in Russia at the moment, so there hasn't been any official comment on that. And I wouldn't necessarily expect them to comment on that sort of flippancy either. But they are concerned about the Greenland issue. Putin was talking about this last summer. And I think in many ways it's more important to him than Venezuela. It's obviously a lot closer. There's oil and gas reserves in the Arctic region. Yes, China and Russia are both plowing money and ships into developing something called the Arctic Sea Route. This is sort of, a much quicker route from from European Russia to China than currently has become viable because of global warming. And we know also that Putin has ordered an increase in military might around the Arctic area. The Arctic area, Greenland included, has always been a very sensitive area during the Cold War, East Russia versus the West, etc., sort of Union versus the West, because it is the shortest way between the two countries. If you're going to send missiles from from Soviet Union to Russia or vice versa. That is the quickest route. So it is important to Russia. We do see Putin commenting on the Arctic situation fairly often, actually. You often read about it in the newspapers, how they are developing these sea routes, how military is moving around there. That's where Russia does a lot of its test firing of its missiles, etc. And I think this will definitely be an issue that the Kremlin will be keeping a close eye on.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, as I say, first time we've chatted this year. At the end of last year, there were a lot of annual roundups of where we are and where's the war going, etc., etc. And one of them featured the Russian economy, which obviously is very central to this whole issue. So just zooming on that for a moment, I know you get to see some really interesting stats and perhaps more tellingly the actual evidence from the ground. But where do you see Russia's economy at the start of 2026?
So all the indicators, Dom, are that the Russian economy is totally flatlining this year. I mean, even the Russian central bank has admitted this. They sort of hinted at recession over the hill. And there have been some, obviously, I think it's 40% or more than 40% of government spending in Russia now is geared towards the military or the industrial military complex to feed into its war in Ukraine. There's constant stories about underfunding in various public utilities, lifts, price of utilities in Russia is going up. Russian railways say they're going to invest 20% less into their systems this year than previously, etc., etc. January 1st was an important date in Russia because several things happened at the same time which point to economic problems down the line. From January 1st, VAT in Russia went up to 22% from 20%. This was an increase which has been specifically earmarked as a rise needed to fund the military in Ukraine. Obviously, it's going to push up prices across the board. Everyone's going to pay for this. There was a rush on consumer spending in November in Russia as consumers tried to get in their spending before this VAT increase. So analysts obviously predicting quite a heavy drop-off the first quarter of this year. So I think the economy is definitely going to have a downtick then. So that's something to watch out for. We've also seen an increase in the minimum wage in Russia by 21%, a large increase there. Inflation is officially much less than that, but I think that is an important number because it gives a real indication of, what the Kremlin may consider real inflation to be, more like 21%. So that's an important number. There's also been an increase there's been some punitive stuff, which I just want to highlight here. It came on January the 1st, had an increase in taxes, but not across the board, Dom, just for people who are labelled as foreign agents. These are troublesome people that the Kremlin doesn't like, people who have stepped out of line around the war in Ukraine, commentators who have transgressed some sort of invisible line, etc. And the Kremlin actually made it easier for people to be labelled foreign agents last year. It's a great stigma in Russia. But now also foreign agents in Russia have to pay more tax. So they now have to pay an income tax of 30%, compared to everyone else. Russia's on a sliding scale and of income tax between 13 and 22%. For an agent, you get to pay 30%. So that's a new law which came in, or new tax rate rather, which came in on January 1st. And the other big news on January 1st, Dom, which is worth pointing out to listeners, is that the FSB are now, that's the Russian security services, they've now been allowed to reopen detention facilities in their own prisons. They used to run Russia's prisons. They were made to give them up, actually by Putin, eventually in 2006, January 1st, 2006, as a precondition for Russia having joined the Council of Europe a few years earlier. Russia's now left the Council of Europe, it left in 2022, and Putin now wants the FSB to have its own prisons again. The human rights people have all said these are likely to become extreme interrogation and torture chambers, etc., sort of even worse than the normal prisons in Russia. Two Russian analysts who are very good on the intelligence services in Russia, Andrei Soldatov and Irina Bogdanov, they wrote in their blog that under the control of the FSB, these prisons point to preparations for more repression on a scale we have never seen before in Russia. So definitely a chilling piece of news there.
James, what have you got by way of final thoughts?
So, Dawn, I think it's worth flagging up to podcast listeners who are interested in the war in Ukraine, primarily the health of Ramzan Kadyrov. He's the president of Chechnya and a great Putin flag waver. He's been involved quite heavily in the war in Ukraine, as we've covered before, sending his forces down there. They've been accused of various human rights abuses, but also accused of being more interested in TikTok than fighting, etc. But the news from Kadyrov is he'd gone to Moscow before Christmas and was meant to be at a meeting head of various regions with Putin on Christmas Day. He was taking ill, apparently, on Christmas Eve on December 24th. This was reported by various independent, I sort of best describe them, Russian news websites. And then he disappeared for a few days. His various officials denied the rumours, said they'd been spread by Satanists, etc. But now these rumours about Kadyrov and his various health issues have been, running fairly well for 5 or 6 years now. They've always been denied, but they've always been also strongly backed up by circumstantial evidence. Anyway, after Kadyrov disappeared from view, there were several videos put out around the 1st and 2nd of January, undated videos showing him chatting to people in and around Grozny, his capital down in Chechnya. That was all fairly standard. But the video which really stood out to me came yesterday on his channel. In the video, he was with a group of other Chechen men, elder men, and they were inspecting the opening of a madrasa, a religious school in Chechnya somewhere. And in this video, he looked, I would say, unusually gaunt and thin. He'd been accused of previously being overweight. His eyes were very red-rimmed. He had some sort of clear plastic tag on one finger. It could be medical, it was very unclear. But most importantly, he was actually using a wooden stick for the first time. I've never seen him use a stick before. I've been covering Kadyrov on and off since before he was president for more than 20 years, and I've never seen him using a wooden stick. So, Dom, something is up there. This is clearly a man, if I was a betting guy, I would say that Kadyrov's health is probably not very good, and definitely another story worth looking at.
Yeah, thanks, James. Just on that, I've seen some reports saying that there'd be a power vacuum if he were to suddenly die, but he's been trying to groom his son, hasn't he, to take over from him, but he is not yet seen as the heir apparent. He hasn't quite got the political support that Kadyrov would want. Is that a fair approximation? Where do you think we are in terms of succession if he were to die?
Yeah, I think that's a decent synopsis, Dom. Yeah, he's got, I think it's 3 sons. His favoured is the younger son, Adam. He's particularly thuggish. He was the one who went and beat up a guy in a Chechen prison a couple of years ago. He'd been arrested for insulting Islam, and this guy's handcuffed in a prison cell, and everyone just beat him up. He's also been given various medals and appointments in Chechnya. He's met Putin. He got married last year. He posed with a golden gun and always bling, and he likes to hang out in Dubai and drive fast cars. He is clearly the favoured son, and he's clearly the guy that Ramzan Kadyrov wants to take over from him. What we really need to see in terms of succession in Chechnya, because it's such a troublesome spot for the Kremlin, is some indication from Putin, from the Kremlin, about who they see and as a succession and where they see it's going. Adam Kadyrov has met Putin. I think maybe Kadyrov's oldest son has also met Putin. It's not entirely clear. I'd say succession is fairly convoluted, though it's very clear who Kadyrov wants to take over. Chechen politics is very tribal and complicated. I think Kadyrov, he's not even 50. If he was to die, if he was or become incapacitated, it would become a major headache and a major distraction for Putin. There's a lot to fight over in Chechnya. There's a lot of money flowing from the Kremlin, from Moscow to Chechnya. There's a lot of oil wealth. There's a lot of arms, a lot of smuggling. It's a bounty jewel if you can get your hands on it.
Thanks, James. Now then, for my final thoughts, I've been asked over the weekend by a few people for my thoughts on Venezuela and the issue of preemptive military action. Now, these are just my thoughts here, possibly need expanding on maybe battle lines, but as I've been asked, and obviously this comes in the wake of a lot of people saying, it's exactly the same. If America does that, then Russia's totally justified in doing what it's done in Ukraine. So I was asked for my thoughts on it. Now today, so there's a lot of talk about this act by America being illegal as it's counter to international law. Now, as I've said before, there is no international law. That term refers to a broad understanding of how he would like the world to be based on past experience, precedents, treaties, agreements and so on. To be an actual law requires an overarching authority with the power to sanction by force, if necessary, bad behaviour. If you can't do that, it's not a law. It's good to have something to aim for, but in my view, presently, there is no international law. The world has no such overarching authority. If there was, where was international law when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014? Europe at the time was binging itself on Russian oil and gas, making any condemnations seem somewhat performative in my view. And we see the same today. We've seen it over the weekend. South Africa today says the operation by the US, they see it as, quote, a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations, which mandates that all member states refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Fair enough. But that didn't stop President Cyril Ramaphosa of being very pally with Putin at the various BRICS summits that they've attended, either in person or virtually, since the start of the full-scale invasion. Spain's Foreign Minister, José Manuel Álvarez, also today said the action was clearly contrary to international law. OK, Mr. Álvarez, so what? America says it was legal under their domestic law. So which law is best? Now, when it comes to military action, for me, there is a tension between these notions of international law, actual treaty obligations that in some jurisdictions under human rights law offer protections, and the protections afforded to civilians and military alike when combat starts under various laws of armed conflict, based on Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, etc., other treaties that aim to impose limits on our behaviour when humanity is at its worst. Plus, I would say, in the post-mission accomplished in Iraq world that we now live in, responsible states that take preemptive military action without thinking about what comes next risk diminishing their national power and freedom of future action. So let's have a look at America's preemptive military action in Venezuela and Russia's in Ukraine. Were they legal? Irrelevant. Irrelevant for the reasons I've just stated. Legality is in the eye of the beholder, and there is no international law. So were they necessary? Were they proportionate? Were they taken against imminent threats? I think the US has a much stronger case here. I think there's good evidence, as the US administration says, that the national security threat to the US was real and ongoing, and some sort of action was therefore necessary. The operation does seem to have been proportionate, i.e. limited in scope and duration. It has not been received as being so egregious that it has soured relations with allies. Russia, I think, have a far weaker case. Russia's defence of their initiation of action in February 2022 and the continued use of violence now, for me, fails the tests of necessity, proportionality and concerns about any imminent threat. And that is before we look at how Russia has conducted itself militarily, with the murders of prisoners of war, kidnapping of children, that kind of thing, all condemned by the United Nations. Now, Venezuela was not a precedent for such action, one state doing what it wants on the territory of another state. Let's not pretend it is. Let's not pretend it was. Hand-wring our way around irrelevant concepts of international law and just hope that bad people in the world decide to change their ways. Right? For me, preemptive military action can happen, is going to happen, and in certain circumstances should happen, my view only. The issue for me is how responsible a state is after doing it. You could say that this is where might is right means the responsibility to protect. Remember that one? Remember R2P? Remember that concept supported by the UN? Said sovereignty is conditional on responsible behaviour and can be challenged in certain circumstances, including through the use of military power. So for these reasons, I do not see every instance of preemptive military action as being unacceptable or of setting a new precedent or fundamentally undermining humanity. For me, it's all about the reasons why such action is taken, the conduct of one's forces during such action, and one's response afterwards. I therefore do not see a moral equivalence between the US action in Venezuela and Russia's action in Ukraine, and potentially any action China might take over Taiwan. Now, I do not like the way that Maduro has been paraded through the streets of New York. These kind of images we have seen before. This trophy aggrandizement is the kind of thing we see from ISIS, from Hamas. But if the US now accepts it has a responsibility to help what happens next in Venezuela and calls out preemptive military operations in the future that fail the tests of necessity, proportionality, imminence and conduct, I, Dom Nicholls, speaking only for me, do not condemn the US action in Venezuela, as I continue to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. I do not see those two ideas being contrary to each other. As a parting thought, though, I would say that for the reasons I've outlined before, I will utterly condemn the US if it takes military action against Denmark over Greenland. My thoughts only, folks. I would welcome any comeback on that. I welcome a discussion. There's a lot here. I mean, we could go on for ages, but I just wanted to give a very quick update, a very quick view from me as I've been asked, and it's a very live issue. So please treat it in that way. I welcome your comments to ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and we will continue the conversation. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.